So my friend Scott Reeder told me that he wanted to have the top podcast in the whole world. This was the beginning of a conversation with him. So I was like, okay, Scott, that's really cool. Have you ever been involved in podcasting before? Have you ever done anything, even in maybe audio production or anything like that? And he hadn't. His background was entirely in reporting. He was a very, very accomplished and reputable journalist, and he wanted about a murder that occurred in 1991, and he wanted to get this information out to the public, and he had very high ambitions for what he wanted to do with it. So I said, cool, but just so you know, like 99% of podcasts don't do more than a few thousand downloads per episode. This is just the reality of what we're dealing with. And he was like, that's why I'm paying you the big bucks, right? And I was like, well, okay, sure, whatever. I like big, audacious goals. And so what we did was we jumped in. This was about 6 months before we would launch the podcast. And we jumped in with both feet. And 6 months later, 3 weeks after launch, we had done 1 million downloads total, and we'd hit number two in iTunes. So I feel okay about it because like the #1 podcast throughout all that time was this podcast called Pod Save America. Pod Save America, that's what it was called, which you may or may not have seen. It's still the #1 podcast in the world. It just hasn't really been beaten. It's actually an interesting podcast from most of President Obama's staff. So I like to think that it took the promotional efforts of Obama and actually President Trump also taking office at the same time to keep us out of the #1 spot. So anyways, I want to go through a little bit of how we accomplished that because I really want to get practical. I don't have slides for you. I hope that's okay, but it's podcasting, right? So no visuals needed. So my name is Colin Thomson. I run a digital media agency called Kast Media, and we really focus on podcasting. And we have clients that range from brands like Verizon, NPR, also influencers, people like Tai Lopez, other people you may have heard of. We work with all these brands and influencers on their podcasts. And I got interested in podcasting initially. I think it's important to talk a little bit about why podcasting. And to understand why podcasting, I think we need to understand why content marketing. And hopefully I don't have to start too much from the ground level when it comes to content marketing. Hopefully we kind of understand that concept. But the idea being, one of the most powerful ways to get your message out there and to build an audience and then to actually create an audience that's ready to buy from you, that's ready to buy what you're selling, which is what marketing is all about, is through content, is through giving them useful, valuable information for free that they can put to use. By being valuable to them, you create trust with them so that when they're actually in the market for whatever it is that you sell, they come to you. That's the concept behind content marketing, right? And traditionally, content marketing was really focused on blogs. And I've heard a lot of talks about blogs already today here. And I think it's especially exciting, blogs are especially exciting to affiliate marketers because you have all the options for SEO and for getting a bunch of new attention that way. People haven't heard about you, discovering you through Google and through your best SEO practices. But the reason that podcasting is so exciting to me and that my clients, Kast Media's clients, tend to see such good results when it comes to podcasting as their content marketing play is because it's one of the only forms of long form, one of the only types of long form content that is actually currently consumed in its entirety, usually. So this means that what we're finding is that when it comes to long form content, it's very hard to get a customer or a potential customer or an audience member to reach the end of your long form content. So we're comparing this with, say, a blog post. Blog posts that are several pages in length are getting more and more popular because what bloggers are finding is that when they can convince an audience member to reach the very end of that blog post, they've reached a level of trust with that audience member, with that reader, that they wouldn't have with a shorter blog post. So there's this balancing act. On the one hand, it's harder to get people to come to actually consume that amount of content, but once they do, they're more valuable to you. They're more on your side. They get it. They trust you. They see you as an expert. A lot of bloggers are using the strategy of, I want to create the end-all like how-to or the end-all, be-all, end-all of like one specific topic and write this whole long thing on it so that people really trust me as the expert in that area. And there's just untold value when it comes to establishing yourself as an expert. Establishing yourself as an expert in whatever your category is. Well, podcasting is interesting because we hear time and time again that users' attention span is getting shorter. And we see this basically in every category, whether it's a video or whether it is on blogs. But one of the only places that we don't really see it is in podcasting. This is because podcasting, by its very nature, the way that we consume podcasts is actually meant to be multitasked. It's meant to be a consumption that encourages multitasking. So we're actually playing on a user's, like, I don't know, short attention span to say, okay, do all of these other things, because our podcast listeners, they listen to the podcast while they're working out, while they're commuting, while they're doing other things, probably maybe even while they're like doing things that they shouldn't actually be listening to a podcast while they're doing. Just because we, like humans, we have this insatiable desire to do more than one thing at once. And it's not always good for us, but it's great for podcasters because our genre, our format fits right into that desire to multitask. So that's why we're finding that people like Joe Rogan, he has a podcast that like usually goes 3 hours in length, which is just absurd. It's mind-blowing. And people listen to the whole thing. A lot of people listen to the whole thing. It's crazy, but it's because of the content itself. If he just wrote all of that out, you know, and like each episode is basically like a book in length, like a short book, he wouldn't be getting that kind of engagement. But instead, people are like, well, this is a conversation I want to be a part of. This is interesting. And maybe they can't get to it in 1 3-hour like sit down, like one time of consuming it, but over the course of a few commutes, they sure can. Or if they live in Los Angeles, like I do, over the course of like half a commute, they can. And so that's kind of some of the power that we're starting to see, and the reason that podcasting in general has been on the rise. So voice, and before I get too far, please interrupt me with any questions or any thoughts. I kind of tried to come up with an angle on this that makes sense for affiliate, but is also more generally marketing and all, but it's going to help me to understand where all of you stand as far as your relationship to podcasting. Yes, question? Yes, that's how I'm referring to it here, and it can go both ways, but what we're seeing is that the podcasters that are taking advantage of both, they're usually putting the video up on YouTube, and then it's kind of a separate thing. Even the not just the presentation, but a lot of times the edit is done differently too. So for this, I'm talking about audio only. So who here has either had or has a podcast or is involved in one? Oh, wow, nice. Yeah, like half-ish. And who here is interested in potentially starting one? Cool, everyone else. So that's exciting. That's really exciting. And that's helpful to me. So I think that to get back to the idea of long-form content, the value of, well, let me give you one example of the value of long-form content. I used to run a business that was an online training platform for musicians, and we taught pianists how to sight read. And I went on this one podcast, and it didn't have a huge audience. This is before I was involved personally in podcasting. And I talked with this guy for an hour or so about the platform and about what it was that I was putting together. And what I found was there was a marked difference between the people who came to me because they found me through whatever other method they may have found me, and the people who came to me through that podcast. Because the people who came to me and had heard about me from that podcast, they already knew what was going on. If I tried to pitch them or something, they would just be like, no, shut up. I just want to buy, I'm ready. They were there. They were already there because I'd basically already pitched them for an hour, and you can never really have the opportunity to actually pitch somebody for that long, but unless you're talking to them, in a podcast situation. So the opportunity to be in somebody's, ears like that, it develops this level of trust with them that's hard to replicate on other platforms. You could argue things like video would be more because you're seeing them as well, but again, we're getting into the long-form content aspect of it and saying, if I've got a podcast, I put out 2 episodes a week, and they're each 45 minutes long, you're consuming, and you subscribe to me, you're consuming an hour and a half of my content every week. That's a lot. That's a significant amount of trust that you're gaining over time from listening to that amount of content that I'm putting out. That's why I'm so excited about podcasting as content. What we're seeing in terms of the trend line of podcasts is that they don't, I say podcasts, but this goes for audio in general, audio platforms in general. Yeah, question? Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So the question was, and it's an interesting angle, and it's something that we see a lot of times, the popularity of the interview-based podcast and the fact that maybe you're not actually the top expert in this area, but you could interview the top experts in this area and kind of bring their expertise to bear so that you can kind of be perceived as an expert in that area yourself. And learn and become an expert. There's so much value when it comes to that interview-based thing, the Lewis Howes and the Tim Ferrisses and those sorts of people that are doing it. So much value in that because you have an excuse to network with high-level individuals in your category. You have, in some ways, you're sort of borrowing their expertise or their brand trust. And then you're learning from them, and then they're helping you build your brand as well. I think that most of the people who start out doing that sort of thing, they do it over Skype, and so they're less often are they just inviting those people out to their house or whatever, because there's ways that you can do it via Skype, and there's ways you can do it via a platform called Zencastr, Zencastr.com, that sounds much better than just a Skype conversation because of the technology behind it. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Sorry to ask a very basic question. Mm-hmm. What mic do you use, and what other software besides Zencastr? Yeah. Good question. So I think that whenever I'm advising somebody who's just kind of getting into the space, I always try to, use the minimum viable product route, the idea of what's the least you can put in to get a really good understanding of if it's the right platform for you or not, and if it really makes sense for you or not, because there's a lot of people who put a lot of emphasis on the equipment, especially because podcasting has to do with the equipment. We actually need equipment versus blogging, you just need a computer. The equipment, the difference between mics makes such a small amount of difference when it comes to the final product that you can, if your content is good, you can be recording it on your phone and it'll still be good. That's not to say that that's ideal, but that it'll still be good. So there are so many, I would refer you, because it is a little involved to get into all the technicalities, I refer you to Pat Flynn has an amazing 4-part video of just walkthrough on all the technicalities, setting it all up. John Lee Dumas does as well, and you don't have to pay the $1,500 to get into Podcaster's Paradise. You can just, he's got a free one. And you can also pay the $1,500 to get into Podcaster's Paradise if you want. Yeah, so I would refer you to those things, but I would say that focusing on content is key when it comes to this, because that's going to be the difference maker as far as whether or not you find it to be successful. And jumping off of that idea, I think that podcasting is a really cool hack. And I want to get into growth hack, and I want to get into some of the ways that we grew that podcast that I mentioned first. Suspect Convictions is a true crime podcast. You can look it up on iTunes. We did 1 million downloads in 3 weeks, and we made it to number 2 in iTunes. And that's not new and noteworthy, because new and noteworthy is a whole different thing that's a lot easier to game. That's iTunes overall. And we did that because we started out early enough networking, and that, I think, is one of the aspects of the podcasting industry as a whole that people have found to be super powerful when it comes to growing something from ground zero, from nothing. What we did, because we didn't have the backing of a network, we weren't a part of like Gimlet Media or anything like that, was we approached a bunch of other shows, and we used all the social proof that we could find in terms of names we had attached and that sort of thing. And we didn't approach it in a way of like, you know, let us be a guest on your show or that sort of thing, but rather we want to, Scott Reeder is a very established and well-respected journalist. He could bring a lot to bear on your case, because we were dealing with a lot of true crime podcasts. That was our category. So networking in a value add way, you know, not networking in a what can you do for me, networking in a what can I do for you way. And just a few wins when it comes to getting on other shows and not just pitching your show, but bringing value to their listeners really moves the dial in a huge way. And I can tell you, because I've done it both ways. I've gotten people booked on, you know, hundreds of shows in relation to a PR launch, and on just a few big shows. And a few big shows is moves the dial a lot more than like 100 small shows. Yes. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the question is, what's the best length of time for a podcast? And it's a tough question, because podcasting, a big portion of the value add of podcasting is the fact that it can be long form, and you can get away with long form. I think unless your pitch, your angle is like 5-minute marketing, I think there's a podcast called 5-Minute Marketing. Unless like that is your angle, I think you should go longer than shorter, because otherwise you're not taking full advantage of the platform itself. So I would say 20 minutes to 45 minutes, and you can vary it up within that, but that's kind of where I've seen the best results when it comes to this. Who here is familiar with the concept of the rise of voice? No one? Voice. Voice as opposed to audio. So this is referring to Amazon Alexa, or Siri, or Google Home, or HomePod from Apple, I think, whenever that comes out. This is a little bit more out there concept of why I'm so excited about podcasting and audio content as well. Google's told us that 1 out of 5 mobile queries right now are done via voice. 20%. Which is a huge number of mobile queries if you think about it. That blew my mind when I heard that. I would have thought it would be like 3% or something. 20%. And not only that, but 43% of millennials have made a purchase on a voice-first device in the last year. So not only are we seeing adoption with voice-first devices when it comes to surfing the web and interacting with the web, we're seeing adoption of actions that require trust. You know, like making a purchase requires trust. Like, I'm a millennial, and I probably wouldn't do that. I wouldn't be part of that 43%, because I would just feel weird saying, you know, telling Alexa to buy this thing for me. I'd be like, no, I want to be sure it's doing it right, and I would just type it in. But I guess that's not what we're seeing, 43% of millennials. And so what we're seeing is a fundamental shift in the way that we communicate with the internet. And if you think about it, speaking and listening is more fundamental to our methods of communication than writing or typing, whatever the case may be. I think, we talked before we wrote with each other. So that's a trend that's less, sexy and exciting than, like, say, AR or AI or any of the other little 2-letter acronyms out there that are really hot topics right now. But it's now. Like 20% of mobile search queries, that's right now. We don't know how long some of the more exciting things are going to take. We don't know if it's going to be 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I think voice is like, it's now, and it's 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So then, of course, the question comes, how does that relate to podcasting? Well, I mean, if you know the podcasting platform, you know that we're not really set up at the moment to take advantage of that. It's not like you can tell Alexa, or you can ask Alexa, hey, what's the answer to this question? And because I answered it on my podcast, she's going to pull that in. We don't have that sort of indexing going on in the platform at the moment. But it is, and I can't point to exactly how it's going to happen, obviously. I mean, I can't really predict the future. But the overall trend is towards audio and towards voice. And all that's lacking is the indexing of that audio content. So I think anyone who is getting into audio content is setting themselves up for success in the future as we move more and more towards voice and audio being the main way in which we interact with the internet. So that's another concept that I think points towards strong growth. And we see this, what we see with audio in general is that it's not, like I said, it's not exciting, it's not sexy, it's an undercurrent. And for about the past 10, 15 years, podcasts, the number of people who have listened to a podcast in the last month has gone up by about 2% every year. About 2%. It's somewhere in the low 20s right now-ish, I think, in the US. In Australia, it's much higher, actually. Australia has very high. I think it's well above half in Australia. So podcasts have really taken off there. But we've seen this continual progression, which means it's an undercurrent, it's a trend, but it's a trend that has staying power. It's not something that just pops up and goes away really quick. That's not what we've seen. We've just seen continual growth, aided by the big hits like Serial here and there that have come along and brought a lot of extra awareness to the platform. But we see this just continual growth in it. So I want to make sure that, because it sounds like we might have a lot of practical questions as well. So I want to make sure that I go the direction that makes the most sense. Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that question. So your question was relating to the podcast advertising, if you're looking at being an advertiser on podcasts. And it's a really good question because what we're seeing when it comes to trends is that podcasters can charge much higher CPMs, cost per 1,000 impressions, than most other platforms because they're able to show good ROI for their advertisers. Because their guests, like I've talked about everything up until this point from the perspective of this is why maybe you should consider being a podcaster. All of those things, that trust that is developed from the host, translates into each impression being worth a lot more than a banner ad on a website or something like that. So when it comes to podcasts, you are likely to pay a CPM of somewhere between $13 and $40 for a general. I know that's a large range, but that's the range for a general category podcast. If you're advertising on something more specific, like I don't know if anyone listens to Andrew Warner's Mixergy podcast, he gets CPMs of over $100, which is just mind blowing. But it's because he gets ROI for his sponsors. So that's just, if you're making more than that, well, you're willing to spend that. And I think that that points toward the power of the influence. There's not a great platform for, like, you know, if you want to buy Facebook ads, it's super easy to just like pop in there and put in your bid and all that sort of thing. Super fun. I love that. I wish that we had that for podcasts. We don't. We have, which is why in some ways it's also an underpriced asset, I think, because it requires, anything that requires more effort to do is going to be somewhat underpriced. So you can go through places like Midroll, or Podcast One, or Spreaker, I think, has their own platform. There's a few of them out there, but it still is this interesting, almost like one-on-one interaction with the podcaster, where you're saying, you know, you're getting how many impressions? Okay, I'll pay you this much to sponsor it, and that whole deal like takes place. That's part of what my company does as well, as negotiate that deal. Which is why it's kind of like a little bit old-fashioned, in that we're actually even negotiating the deal to begin with. We're not like, you know, cost per click. We're not any of that. We're very old-fashioned, but the value is there. It really is. Yeah. So there are so many things. The reason that I tend to focus on getting on other shows is because when it comes to getting the word out about your podcast, like I said, there's somewhere in the 20% of at least Americans who regularly listen to podcasts. So if you do general sort of advertising towards it, you're only speaking to about 25% of the people that you're getting in front of. Whereas if you get on another podcast, they're all in the habit of listening, you're getting in front of 100%. That being said, we've had good success with Facebook ads as long as we use like the foundation being people who have liked a page that is a brand that is podcast first. So say everyone who liked the cereal, it's like, you know, 800,000 people. And then we'll take that as like our starting point, and then we'll also target our interests within that. And now we know that those interests, they're all podcast listeners also. Or you could do maybe like Lewis Howes. Lewis Howes is a good like podcast first brand. Somebody like Tim Ferriss, less so, because he's more of like an author. You know what I mean? Like he wasn't really a podcast first. So as long as you go podcast first, you just kind of have to think about all of your paid advertising and your promotions from that perspective of how can I refine it? How can I make my foundation be podcast listeners and then refine within that? That's what we've seen. Also, Overcast, the app Overcast, has a I shouldn't tell you this because these ads get swept up so quickly, and usually it's by me, so now we'll just be competing for them. But you can get subscribers for about $1 per, which is one of the only measurable platforms for getting subscribers. Yes. Overcast, yeah. Yeah. Well, we got 2001 technology that we're dealing with. No, I mean, iTunes could make that public if they wanted to, of course. So podcast analytics is just this whole mess that is this RSS feed. iTunes, I mean, Apple promised us that there's more analytics coming at the end of this year. Right now, even like shows that we host and that we see all of their stats on, we can see downloads. We can't see drop-off points within the episode. You could have listened to it for 1 second, or you could have listened to the whole thing. I don't know the difference. So it's a huge blind spot when it comes to like it's why stats only mean so much. It's why I can throw out vanity metrics like 1 million downloads in 3 weeks, and maybe I released 21 episodes because I released an episode per day. I didn't. I released 7 episodes. We had about 150,000 listeners. But you know what I mean? Like there's a drastic difference between 1 million downloads in 3 weeks on 21 episodes versus 5 episodes. iTunes hasn't made any of that public when it comes to download numbers, and they haven't promised to do it either. I don't think that'll be part of the rollout of more analytics. I think it'll only be for podcasters. Yeah. FeedBurner is so outdated, and they're not keeping it up, and it's horrible. The other, I mean, so Libsyn is my favorite, and Libsyn, yeah, and I just Libsyn. It stands for Liberated Syndication. They're like one of the OGs. They've been around since like 2003 or something like that, and they're really, really good. And they're really good for optimizing for exposure in iTunes, because there's a whole specific things that need to be done with the feed, with the RSS feed when it comes to that. But Libsyn is my favorite for that. Yes. Yeah, so if you're a podcaster and you want to start reaching out to sponsors, how many downloads should you have before you start doing that? Usually, I would say, so it really depends on how niche you are. If you are, if you have a podcast that's going to be just so perfect for some sponsors, you can start doing it with only a few thousand. But if you are just a podcast that's for everyone, you need at least probably 10 or 15,000. Those are kind of the two numbers as far as niche or not niche. They say it's my time. But I can answer any questions up here too. I'll wait around for any questions. So thank you so much, everyone.